Good morning, everyone. My name is Allison Van Dyke, and I'm the Executive Director of the Temple of Understanding. And I want to welcome you to the Eco-Justice for All series entitled The Perspective of Religious Naturalism. This series is an ongoing program of the Temple of Understanding, a 63-year-old interfaith organization whose mission is to advocate for interfaith values in the secular setting of the United Nations as an NGO and across the world. Our focus for the past 12 years has been to increase the awareness of religious leaders and actors of our climate crisis and its negative impact on achieving the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, in particular peace, justice, women's health and safety, food sovereignty, and environmental sustainability. It is my pleasure today to introduce to you our dialogue speakers. Ursula Goodenough is Professor of Biology Emerita at Washington State University, where she taught cell biology and evolution and engaged in research on green cell algae. She served as president of the American Society for Cell Biology. She also taught many other classes. She and others are developing what is called religious naturalism, an orientation that is new and exciting. Her new book, a second edition of The Sacred Depths of Nature, will be published by Oxford University next month. In it, she examines cosmology, evolution, cell biology, and all aspects of life, which she suggests can serve as a basis for planetary ethics. Welcome, Ursula.
Thank you.
Carol Wainwright is Interim Director of the Griot Center and Professor of Philosophy of Religion at Bucknell University, specializing in religious naturalism, science and religion, and critical theory, among other theories. She has written numerous books, including The Legacy of Anne Conway, 1631-70, Reverberations from a Mystical Naturalism, and a book entitled Black Lives and Sacred Humanity, Towards an African-American Religious Naturalism, which won a Choice Award for Outstanding Academic Titles. She's published numerous articles and essays and received a number of international awards, including an Oxford University Fellowship in Religion and Science. Welcome, Carol.
Thank you very much.
Mary Evelyn Tucker, our moderator today, is professor at Yale University School of the Environment and Yale Divinity School. With John Graham, she organized 10 conferences on world religions and ecology, which resulted in a series of 10 volumes from Harvard University. She is also co-director of the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And along with John Grimm and Brian Swim, she co-created the Emmy Award-winning film, Journey of the Universe, which included a book. She has also awarded many number of honorary degrees and a Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Society for Science and Religion, Nature and Culture. Welcome, Mary Evelyn.
Thank you so much.
Yours.
Thank you, Allison, and a longtime friend of the Temple of Understanding, knowing your wonderful founder, Juliet Hollister. We go back many, many decades. And I want to say the same about these two extraordinary speakers, writers, thinkers, activists. Ursula Goodenough, a great friend, one who contributed enormously to Journey of the Universe, the book and the film, and Carol, having shared a department with you at Bucknell, the religion department, and your collegiality was so important to John and me. So it's just a joy to be with you, and I hope we can continue these conversations going forward, actually, because we have here two of the really creators in some ways of the modern movement of religious naturalism. There's a website, which I'm sure will be put into the chat, and your questions will be welcome. That's where your questions will be as well. So I'm going to just start with some general questions to both of these extraordinary thinkers. about what is religious naturalism, and how did, well, we'll just do first, what is religious naturalism? And then we'll come back and say, how did this shape you in your thinking? But let's define it first. And Ursula, if you could take the floor to do that, and then over to Carol.
Okay, well, I'll try to be succinct. So let's start with naturalist. So I try not to use naturalism, because naturalism suggests that there's some, confined text and dogma about naturalism. And I like naturalist better. Naturalist describes a person, and we think of a naturalist as someone going out with binoculars and looking at birds, but naturalist in my way of thinking goes deeper than that. A naturalist is curious about and takes in the science-based understandings that we now have about the cosmos, about life, about evolution, and so on, takes these understandings to mind as a core worldview. When you add the religious to it, then, as opposed to just being a vanilla naturalist, let's say, a religious naturalist takes this story, what we call everybody's story, and responds to it religiously. And for me, religious responses can be categorized as to having three dimensions. One is an interpretive dimension. One takes the story of one's religious orientation and asks what it tells them. What does it tell me about the meaning of life? What does it tell me about death? An interpretive framework. Then there's second is a spiritual framework. How does this make me feel internally, emotionally? What are spiritual responses? Well, for example, reverence, assent, joy, gratitude, lots of spiritual responses to everybody's story. And thirdly, an external, communal. What does this story tell me about the relations, not only with other humans, but relations to the planet, what we call eco-morality. So we have a story and spiritual, interpretive, and moral responses to it. And we say that while a naturalist takes nature to mind, a religious naturalist takes nature to mind, but also to heart.
Great. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Very succinct. Thank you. And Carol, over to you.
Thank you, Mary Evelyn, and Ursula, thank you for beginning that the dialogue. I would like to just add a little bit more to what Ursula has said. As a philosopher of religion, I teach religious naturalism at Bucknell, and I write about it, and I actually conceive of it as a very credible worldview approach to understanding the wonders of science and the value of religion in the contemporary world. I often talk about the set of interrelated perspectives, ideas, concepts that focus on the intricacies of nature in the most expansive sense of that word, and how we humans are part of natural reality, and also how we understand our connection to other natural processes and the implications that Ursula has highlighted, the ethical implications of human and what I call human and the more than human worlds that actually support us and help to define who we are. And to me, it is an exciting, very wonderful way of thinking about affirming life in its most fundamental sense. So I'll stop there.
Perfect. And I'll pick that thread up to say or elaborate, why do both of you think this is a compelling worldview? You've just come from a class, Carol, and we want to know how students are responding to it. I know the Yale students love it, but Ursula, why is this a compelling worldview? And
Let's start with Carol this time. Let's go.
okay, great.
Well, every time I can tell you this, Mary Evelyn, every time I speak about religious naturalism or the religious naturalist orientation, people say, wow, I was one before I even knew of the term itself. So what that suggests to me is that the key metaphors that I highlight, interrelatedness and relationality, constitutive relationality, they're common sense understandings of how we are configured and how the world around us is configured. And it's so compelling because it is a plausible way of understanding some of the thorny, complex issues that are facing us today. If we assume that we are isolated, atomistic entities, we won't get anywhere. And so religious naturalism highlights just one of the most basic principles of understanding life, nature today, that we're deeply, deeply interconnected. And humans who are aware of that as one life form, there are implications when we acknowledge and celebrate that. There are implications that we have in terms of our decisions, choices, how we live, and how we celebrate our connection with more than human nature.
Yes, and that deep sense that you've just expressed, when I say to the students, you love a sunset, you love a mountain climb, a hike, etc. You love being in nature. And when you experience it as spiritual, then it releases what's natural to you and natural to this relationality. And it gives them that sense you just said, I always knew this. But Ursula, over to you. Why is this compelling and moving?
Oh, well, I was going to go a little bit different direction. I mean, it's compelling because nature's fantastic. And what I'm particularly excited about in terms of students is that for many students, this is opening up to them an interest in, a curiosity about, and our scientific understandings of nature, because one can climb a mountain and see a sunset and not think about what the sun is really doing or how the mountain really got there. But if one takes some science courses and really understands these things, or reads popular books about how these understandings deepen our connection with everything, then it's like, it's just a lot bigger. It's not just the mountains being wonderful, but it's also the mountain's history, the mountain's background, the mountain's composition, the mountain's fate, all sorts of things deepen as one becomes a religious naturalist.
Yes. May I say something, Ursula? Like just the other day, I introduced to my students the idea of deep time, geological time. And that's exactly what you were just talking about, that even before humans emerged on the scene, there were these other fascinating entities. And one reason why I also think religious naturalism is so compelling, especially to young people, they have inherited a world, a set of problems and issues that can make them feel paralyzed or nihilistic. And religious naturalism jolts them out of that type of nihilism to see that they themselves can contribute in really fascinating ways if they understand some of the wonders of science, as well as as I said before, the elegance of religious value. And the two are really lovely synthesized within religious naturalism, and emboldens our young people to believe that they can contribute to any foreseeable future. And so it just gives them a sense of hope, as well as a sense of understanding themselves, because we're experiencing a generation of young people who are not within the United States in particular, and Western Europe, who are not subscribing to traditional forms of religion anymore. And they're trying to understand themselves through what they call spirituality. So this is another way of understanding themselves and their connection to that which I call the more.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. And also, just to pick up your points, Carol, you use, this is a weaving of religion and science, but it's also a weaving of deep time and literature. It's science and humanities, right? And I just wanted to call you out on what we share, a love of literature and poetry, and Annie Dillard and Mary Oliver. So when students hear those poems, they're also inspired, right? Do you want to comment on that?
And I'll let Ursula jump in here too, because on our Religious Naturalist Association webpage, we have a variety of expressions by which you can enter into religious naturalism. And of course, science is there, but we also have poetry and literature, and we have the arts widely spoken about. But yes, basically, and Ursula and I have had conversations. You know, I'm not a scientist, but I find it enchanting. It's magical. It's enriching. It's poetic. And if you read Ursula's works, that's what she does. She makes science accessible in this poetic way that I say you can't help but fall in love with it, even in spite of some of the difficulties and challenges of understanding some of the formulas and all. And in that way, Mary Evelyn, what we're talking about is really a poetic way of being in the world, of understanding the beauty of the cosmos and the beauty of life.
Yeah, and we're going to come back to that poetics of nature and your ecological aesthetics. Ursula, any responses here, or jump in with what's on your mind?
My book has 4 Mary Oliver poems and Wendell Berry poems, and you know, I mean, this sensibility, and maybe I'm going to throw it back to you, Mary Evelyn, the sensibility that the natural world is sacred is hardly something that we just came up with a few decades ago. In particular, some of the Asian traditions are particularly robust in expressing and experiencing this understanding and making their surroundings beautiful and chanting chants that extol the natural world. So this is your turf, so go for it.
Well, thank you, Ursula. And you know, it's one of the reasons when I went to Japan with great disillusionment with the 60s and political activism, civil rights, anti-Vietnam War, and I sunk into these traditions in Japan of Buddhism and Shinto and Confucianism, the deep naturalist base of these traditions. I mean, Shinto is all about the kami in the world, you know, and the aliveness of the spirit world, and the sacredness of groves, and on and on. And the Buddhist temples in Kyoto, which I think is one of the most beautiful cities in the world, gave this sense of the temples themselves, the gardens themselves, the Zen gardens, all the Zen arts and so on, give this sense that we are embedded in profound interdependence, you know, the rocks and the pine trees. And I was in a temple once, and it began to snow in the middle of winter. It's just a magical experience. But then I just want to also highlight Confucianism really opened up this world of religious naturalism, because it also included the sense of the concentric circles. We're relational from the very beginning. We're not atomistic, as Carol just said. We're not these hyper Western individuals. So it's from the person to family to society to politics, nature, and the cosmos itself. So this relationality that is in both of Ursula's and Carol's work of cosmos, earth, and human. That's their triad. And it's not broken. It's interconnected, profoundly relational. Anyway, changed my life. And the point here, and then back to you two, is there are traditions outside the West that have profound religious naturalisms. And I think we can draw on those. And I don't want to exclude the West, because Celtic spirituality and other forms, paganism in Western forms, is very much there. So we have lots to draw on to add to this rich basket of sensibilities about nature and so on.
Right. Yeah. I would just like to add one more thing, just in terms of how sometimes, if you look at comparative religion, sometimes some scholars will argue one of the earliest forms of religious practice is animism. And so oftentimes a lot of people will look at some of the tenets of religious naturalism and say, oh, that's similar to animism, where nature is experienced and conceived as vibrant and not dead. And that idea of dead brute nature came by way of Descartes, one of our Western influential philosophers. And so we're returning to a certain type of organicism and vibrancy, understanding nature, and we're allowing science to help us to see that, not just science, but also philosophy. I have to say that there are some philosophical traditions as well, like process philosophy, that also emphasizes these fascinating metaphors of interrelatedness and relationality.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Anything to add, Ursula, there?
No, I guess, continuing to drag out my science-based horn, one of the things that's so exciting about what we now understand is that this relationality not only has to do with our interactions and interdependencies in all of the ecosystems of the planetary matrix, but it has this, billion-year history going back to our common ancestry. The first form of life gave rise to all modern life, and the kinds of things that we can now do looking at genes and relationships between species and all of that Darwin first directed us toward is just making the case that there is no such thing as higher or lower critters or higher or lower races or any of that. It's all coming upwelling from a common source way, way, way back when life first originated.
Yes. And I would just, one final thought around this, I would say that another reason why I think religious naturalism is compelling, it is an ecocentric worldview, ecocentric, yeah, which dethrones humans from thinking that we're at the center.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And to pick up on a point that you made and to move that forward, that idea of the ecocentric worldview that is in animism, is in indigenous traditions and so on, the sense of sentience, the sense of consciousness doesn't rest just in the human, but there's a differentiated sensibility, if you will, ways of being in the world that we now are getting, to your point, Carol, from science. Animal behavior is giving us extraordinary understandings of the communication of mammals, of birds, migration patterns, et cetera. And then we also have this sense of communication in trees and forests and plants. We had 9,000 people here at Yale for a webinar on communication of trees. Yes. So I'd love that religious naturalism is so well based to respond to this. And I'd love either of you to jump in and just speak to this sense of sentience, interconnectedness in the whole natural world.
Well, I don't use the term sentience because it has too many meanings and gets confusing. Yeah. I talk about awareness as being a property that all living beings have, from probably the very first critter that showed up. The first thing that critter needed to do is be aware of where the food is and where the where it's too hot and too cold. So receptors for the outside world started right at the beginning and have absolutely dominate now, so that there are every single living critter, even viruses. The virus is aware of what protein it needs to bind to on the cell that it's going to infect. So awareness is completely universal with the living world. I have chosen in my new edition of my book to restrict the word consciousness to animals with brains, just because it's the brain part is gets you a whole lot of new ideas that started way back when the animals began. And I'm very well aware that consciousness is another one of those words that has deep meaning, and for example in Buddhism as being something else altogether, and so on. So when we use these words, we have to explain what we mean, but that's what I mean. And then what humans came up with is this new thing yet again, which I like to call the I self. So we're not only conscious like all of other animals, but we have this yada, yada, yada thing that wakes up in the morning and goes to sleep at night and has an autobiography. And so we're very, very either blessed or handicapped, it can go both ways, of having this additional self-awareness that is probably, is certainly manifest in dolphins and non-human primates, but we do it in spades. And I would say that's because the other thing that we do is we have developed this thing that we call symbolic language. And the symbolic language is what we then use to develop our cultures and develop this personal sense.
Yes, thank you.
That's a long riff on sentience.
No, but it's relatively new in human consciousness.
Yeah.
Even when we began in academia, that was a question way outside, and now the research is moving in. Kara, what are your thoughts on this
Just
topic?
to add, just a little bit to add from the perspective of philosophy, a number of philosophers of mine and other thinkers who are theorizing this very, very thorny compilation term of consciousness, are really saying that we need to think about it from what Ursula has just said, more in terms of rudimentary awareness of a particular organism to its environment. And so that when we think about consciousness, we are always using the human as the norm. And so we need to get away from that to some extent. And so there's a lot of wonderful debates and ideas of how we can broaden understanding of what traditionally has been the consciousness problem to what I'd like Ursula to identify it as awareness. And also there's some really fascinating stuff going on. So yeah.
I want to just underscore that this is a Western problem by and large. Indigenous peoples understood the aliveness of the natural world in profound ways, and totems of animals and birds are always part of the ritual practices and so on. So that is part of humanity's inheritance. And again, the traditions of Asia have kept this profoundly. There's the sentience in Buddhism of the world around us and so on, or chi, matter energy, you see, as a dynamic unfolding force. And maybe we can move to that sense of process, of change, of emergence, that again, you are both, and Ursula in particular, in terms of emergence, are helping people understand we are part of dynamic changing processes. How exciting. Ursula, over to you.
Well, the emergence concept is pretty straightforward. The universe is made of ultimately subatomic particles that have energy and stuff. They form atoms. The atoms, new kinds of atoms are forged in dying stars, and we have therefore all of this material part of the universe. And some people get very depressed by that. There's a philosopher friend of mine calls it the grunge theory of matter, that matter, just mere matter and only matter isn't interesting, and but it's matter all the way down, and then it's all the way up. And what matter does is forms relationships between materials, and when these relationships form, often via chemistry, we get something else. So the nothing but of the atoms and the molecules interacting generate something else altogether. So we can have countless examples of this. The proteins in a muscle, it's nothing but proteins in a muscle, but what emerges is motility of all sorts, flying and running and crawling. So nature is emergence is nature's mode of creativity. It allows new things to happen from the nothing buts of the material world. And this has been going on for billions of years. And what we have now is this amazing emergent planet.
Yes. And Gordon Kaufman at Harvard had this notion of serendipitous creativity, right? Carol, you have it in your process thinking and so on.
Yeah,
Over
exactly.
to you about this creativity.
Oh, I really don't have anything more to add to that. I just that the philosophies of process, that some of the new materialist philosophies are espousing the same ideas and all. And in the sense, Mary Evelyn, what you were saying, some of the ancient cultures that you are describing, we are discovering the truths through certain lenses here, and additional truths as well. And that's why it's so amazing and so wonderful to realize that we are still discovering aspects of ourselves, of the cosmos, of life, in ways that some earlier humans did not, but yet some of those metaphors and ideas are with us. So there's the continuity, but also there's something new that we are also contributing to the evolution of knowledge itself. And
Yes.
I just want to say one thing about the term religion and the idea of why religious naturalism is so wonderful for me. I look at one etymological understanding of religion: to bind, to connect with another, to relate. And so if one considers nature or naturality to be all, that you're really connected to that which is. And can you just, it boggles your mind to think about all of the implications of what that will do for us as one type of species, as we're relating to all that is. And again, the important ethical implications of that, as beyond the enchanting magical implications.
Right. And in many ways, that's what we've tried to do with the World Religions and Ecology process, the forum work at Yale, involving many, many people, is to examine these traditions for their views of nature, their dynamic sensibilities. So, and also that maybe we can just go a little bit deeper into deep time. It's why Ursula was so kind to be deeply involved in Journey of the Universe, like how we tell this story, which Ursula likes to call everyone's story, everybody's story. So
Loyal group.
evolution itself, back to Carol's point, that evolution is relatively new in human consciousness. And that is one of the most exciting sources of both eco-poetics and eco-morality. So yeah, comment, Ursula, any comments on deep time, evolution, and so on?
It's all great. It's mind-blowing. I mean, you know, the stories that come to us from the traditions are wonderful. And of course, the traditional religions are part of our culture, and our culture is part of nature. It's not outside of nature. It's, you know, when we're talking about natural reality, we have to include human cultures and their religions and philosophies and so on. So we're not talking about discontinuities here at all. But when you take in the deep time, then the story becomes so compelling that there's a way that the stories of the traditions become poetry in a way. They become, you know, understandings, interpretations, in some cases of a supernatural realm, but in many cases, including even some of the monotheisms, have lots of natural understandings embedded in their texts and traditions. And so we're just expanding our understandings from what our ancestors came up with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And I'm looking at a couple of questions also in the chat. One is about, without romanticizing Kyoto and Buddhism and so on, how will scholars connect with teachings about nature and Buddhism, Shinto, Confucianism? And that's why we're talking about the Forum on Religion and Ecology, which for 25 years has tried to do this work with many, many scholars. So we recommend that. You know, I want to come back to a question about how you got into this frame. If you want to share anything of your personal journey. And yeah, Ursula.
Yeah, well, I have a little squiff on it in my book, but I was trained as a scientist. My father was a historian of religion, so religion was always considered important to the family. But he himself, although an ordained Methodist minister, sort of lost his faith in favor of more philosophical Jungian kinds of directions. But I always figured I wasn't religious, and I went through science and everything, and then met some people who began to, sort of say, hello, Ursula, maybe you are religious, maybe the way you feel about all of the things that you understand are in fact religious understandings. And so I was very lucky to have some wonderful mentors, probably the most important being Loyal Rue, who was already thinking about these things from a philosophical standpoint, and lots of people at a group called the Institute on Religion in an Age of Science, where Mary Evelyn and John and Brian also participated, and just lots of conversation finally led me to go ahead and write my first book, where I tried to put some of this down. And once I sort of, put my stamp on it in terms of an actual published book, I've been thinking about it and giving talks and everything since then.
Yeah, Carol, how about you? Anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, so I grew up near the ocean, Chesapeake Bay area, and then New England, Cape Cod area, and have always been enchanted with what we're calling nature. And I just found myself always a sense of feeling centered, peaceful, as well as excited when I'm near water. And it was actually two major things in my life, I think, that led me to religious naturalism. One is, of course, Mary Evelyn, you and John being at Bucknell and telling me about Star Island and telling me about Ursula's work. And it was, I read her first edition of The Sacred Depths of Nature, and was blown away by the ideas that she put forth. And so, whoa, I think I'm a religious naturalist. But the other thing, and I'm sure there are those in the audience who can relate to this. And Mary Evelyn, you will remember my bird Fern, my beloved parrot who lived with me for 25 years. I had the most amazing connection with Fern, a Senegal parrot. She was my beloved in many ways. And it's through my engagement with her, experiences with her, that I recognize how complex and fascinating the more than human world was, even beyond plants and trees. And so it was through my relationship with Fern that sort of sealed me as a religious naturalist as well, in terms of recognizing the dignity, the value of other life forms beyond the human, and what we do to some of these other life forms, and our responsibility to some extent. So those are some of the pivotal reasons why I claimed religious naturalism as part of my professional and personal life and identities.
I love it. And thank you so much, both of you. This relates, I'm going to pick up a question in the chat because of what we've been thinking about. And that is, Marta says when she was a child, she kicked a stone and her mother was like, it's okay because it's part of Mother Earth, but she was taught in church and so on that Earth is inanimate. And her question, picking up on what Carol just said, we're all rediscovering, right, this kinship, relationality with the animal, plant, tree world, etc. And part of this sense, why religious naturalism is so important, is because it goes beyond the inanimate, dead character of matter. And that has huge implications, because colonialism, imperialism in many ways is driven by the conquering of dead matter and extractive industries, etc. So changing this worldview has enormous implications, clearly, and bringing the science, the arts, humanities, and religion together is absolutely critical. Yes. Again, any comments? Yeah, Carol, were you going to say something?
Oh, no, I thank you. Lovely summary, Mary Evelyn. That's really great. No, not right now.
Yeah, I'm just picking up on one of the questions, trying to respond there. Let's pick up another question it's a little broader and brings us back to the religious discussion. And this viewer is saying, is religious naturalism closer to pantheism or panentheism? Now, we should define that first and so on. So Carol,
I'll let you do that one.
Yeah.
We always get that. We always get that question. So I actually do teach both panentheism and pantheism in my classes. So let me first define what they are, and then I will try to insert what I consider to be the religious naturalist distinctive position away from those two. So pantheism is just simply the idea that if you assume that there is a God, that all is God and God is all, the world is God and God is the world. Panentheism, the EN, was actually formulated by Hartshorne, who's a student of Whitehead, who would say, yes, all the world is God, but there's something still extra about God that's not reducible to the world. So there's not that easy equation. God is the world is God. And so both of those positions assume that what we're calling the world can be identified with one's conception of a God or whatever. My version of religious naturalism would say, I don't use theistic language at all. I use the language of more, mystery, whatever, vibrancy, etc. So that there might be, and I wonder what Ursula would say to this, there might be some religious naturalists who utilize the term God. They think that the term God is still worth using, but the way they qualify it is that if you're going to retain God, it has to be a naturalistic process. It can't be supernatural beyond the natural world. So whoever asked that question, I hope my answer was clear. It depends on which religious naturalist you're speaking to as to whether or not they retain the term God. Many of us don't, but some might use it in that naturalistic way.
Thank you, Carol. Ursula, any further?
Yeah, I mean, God still has people that are trying to defend the word. Michael Dowd, who's a good religious naturalist, he calls God as the personification of reality. Now, I don't know why you don't just talk about reality, why you have to personify it, but I mean, he's making a point that we humans do personify, we do give names and stuff. And so if for people who want a name for reality to call it God, go for it. And you mentioned Gordon Kaufman had God as, serendipitous creativity. And we have Tillich, who says God is the ground of being. So there are lots of ways that you can pull God into this, but I just find it gets in the way of where I'm going, and it doesn't help me.
And may I say that when you think about Tillich, they use the term God as a symbol towards, it points to that
Right.
which. And so
Right.
So they use it, they think it's a creative term to help comprehend what you can't really name, but they think it's a helpful term because the term God is an historical term. It evolved in a certain historical context. And for many people, it still has some sort of psychological, emotional significance. For some of us, it doesn't. So, yeah.
So there's two questions. Thank you both. There's two questions that kind of relate to Western religions or Christianity. One is, how does religious naturalism respond to the literal interpretation of the Bible? And I think there's a rather big gap there. So, especially with regard to evolution and things like that. But the other question is from our former student, Carol and mine, Daishin McCabe, who's been a Zen practitioner. And he says, can you say something about how religious naturalism is affecting Christian thinkers or Christianity? Because in our class that he's got students on this call, we're presently studying Christianity. So any way to respond to Christian naturalism and Christianity?
Yes, there is a member of Iris, Carl Peters.
Carl Peters, yeah.
He just wrote a book on Christian naturalism. And I would recommend that you look up that book. It's a very good book. And he's approaching an aspect of religious naturalism from the perspective of a Christian who wants to retain some of the ethical implications of Christianity and the value. But he extends many of the traditional doctrines in ways that are creative beyond the traditional doctrinal approach that some students might have learned about Christianity. So I would recommend reading some of Carl's work.
Good. Carl Peters.
Carl Peters, yeah. Karlpeters.
Great.
Also, there are a number of Unitarians. Cheryl Clark, a Unitarian minister, utilizes religious naturalism in her work in her ministry. And there are a number of Unitarians who also subscribe to religious naturalist principles, ideas, etc., or spirituality.
Right. And you've got certainly some ecofeminists like Rosemary Ruther and Sally McFake and many others who picked up the sense of a universe story and the embeddedness of ourselves in it. So eco-theologians are certainly picking up aspects of this, which is very exciting, and I think really leads this transformative movement for Christianity.
Exactly, yes.
Feminists have been saying this for a long time.
A long time, right. Valerie Plum, ecofeminism, and yes. A lot of actually feminist philosophers also have been saying this. So yeah, many different voices. And religious naturalism, I think, is a lovely, lovely synthesis of some of these different voices.
Yes. And Marta is just saying, I think I did say this, Marta, that when you kicked that stone and your mother said it was not right to do this, but that this larger world has said matter is dead. That's what we were trying to bring forward, so that nature can be respected is the basis of religious naturalism. And let's make a pivot then on that point to Ursula speaks in her book and elsewhere about eco-morality, and Carol's got her beautiful ecological poetics. So the implications of this worldview and ideas are for a change towards nature, less exploitive, et cetera. What about eco-morality, Ursula?
Well, even in the first edition, I made a list of all the things that we're concerned about, and for the second edition, I looked at that was written 25 years earlier, and the only thing that I took out was ozone depletion, because we sort of gotten on top of that one a little bit. But all the other things that we're concerned about, are still alive and well with us. Yet I would say that I argue that one of the reasons we're making so little progress is not only our inherent human individualism and stuff like that, but that we don't share a common story. And that if we're going to share a common story, and therefore in so doing, use that story to guide us as we come up with global policy about how to deal with this list of issues, climate change being obviously at the head, but also it's not just environmental issues. We also have very intersecting racial issues and religious conflicts and so on that are human to human, but that impact the rest of the world and our ability to speak to one another. So my fantasy at the start, and it remains my fantasy, is that someday, probably long after all of us are gone, there might be a planetary ethic, one that is articulated, in fact, in the Earth Charter that Mary Evelyn and her colleagues came up with decades ago, that we all agree to, even as we may have other religions, other ethnicities, other concerns, other ways of doing things. But when we're trying to get planetary, and most of these issues are planetary in the end, we need a planetary religious orientation that will generate what I'm calling eco-morality. And in fact, Mary Evelyn and John and Brian and I gave a conference, 20 years ago on Star Island that we called eco-morality. So we're pushing this. It's just that there's a lot of obstacles.
Yes, and Ursula, just a footnote, the Earth Charter, for those of you who don't know, came out of the Rio Summit in '92, the first international conference on the environment and development, and sponsored by the UN. And our president said, we're not going, President Bush, the first, said, we're not going because we don't want to give up our way of life. Now, what an attitude. But out of that, Gorbachev, one of the great leaders of the 20th and 21st century, said, we need a global ethics. And it took more than 10 years to develop this, but I just want to underscore the prologue says, we are part of a vast evolving universe. Earth, our home, is alive with a myriad community of life. That's what we're talking about here. And eco-morality, incidentally, of course, applies to climate change, but also biodiversity and the loss of life. Up in Montreal at the recent COP conference on biodiversity, there were religious leaders and other environmentalists speaking for how we value all of life. And they've come up with a 30% hope for saving land and species. So this is having traction, a new worldview of how we value life. Carol, please step in with eco-morality or ecological poetics, which I find so compelling as well. What's on your mind?
Oh, I just wanted to say, I actually also, in one of my courses, I have the students read a text by the Dalai Lama around this idea of planetary ethics as well. An ethic for today that brings together the best of all religious worldviews around understanding ourselves as part of a larger, complex set of interrelationships and all like that. So the eco-poetics that Mary Evelyn is referencing is part of my love of literature and poetry. And it is an attempt to suggest that another entry into understanding other ways of understanding the metaphors of interrelatedness and constitutive relationality is through poetry. It's a language that allows you to not just think your way through these things, but to feel your way and to feel and think. And so I use some of the work of Kimmerer, Sheldrake, some of these botanists and other biologists who are saying, you know, if you understand, like Evelyn was saying, how trees communicate, that itself is a type of poetic language. That itself is a type of language that we want to highlight, and not colonial language or colonial settler language that has disenchanted the natural world and made it this brute fact type of thing that you can exploit. And the implications for me also is this poetics of nature is that human ourselves are natural beings through and through. And the eco-morality that Ursula has highlighted is also the fact that the history of the cosmos is also part of the history of human beings. And we need to avoid what we're calling exceptionalism on all of its levels and forms. And one type of exceptionalism is human exceptionalism over against other natural beings, and within the human realm, how we think certain groups and identities are better than others. And so poetics of nature helps us to understand how poetry can speak to us in ways that our hearts can expand and experience the fullness of life and vibrancy and animated beauty and love in the world.
Beautiful. And I love that you picked up on the Dalai Lama, who actually feels we've got to move beyond the narrow category of religion.
And right, exactly.
Right?
Yes, yes.
And
yeah.
Dewey Ming, one of the great Confucian scholars, does the same thing with his work on spiritual humanism, actually.
Yes,
And
yes.
his sense for decades has been we've got to move from an anthropocentric, human-centered worldview to an anthropocosmic worldview, which again, religious naturalism helps us with. two questions in the chat. One is about Matthew Fox. And of course, Matthew Fox has been very relevant to these discussions for years. And he was drawing on Thomas Berry, who had these sensibilities. It's a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects, which is so consonant with religious naturalism and so on. And the other person we should give a shout out to is Donald Crosby, who's done a whole book. Either of you want to say something about his contributions or others?
Well, Don's a philosopher, he's a philosopher, but Don writes a lot of books. I mean, I don't understand how he does it, but he coined the term religion of nature. So we all have these different ways of describing the same thing. And but he was very early on, and those of you who are watching and listening who particularly like philosophical language, my two favorite religious naturalist philosophers are Donald Crosby and then Loyal Rue.
Right.
Loyal, Loyalrue. He has a bunch of fantastic books.
Right. And just to add to that, when I teach my religious naturalism course, I teach Crosby, The Vow of Nature, I teach Rue, and I teach Ursula. Those are the three, for me, those are the three big giants. And it's true historically in terms of the significance of this worldview. And I also have an article on each of them, giving an overview of what I call religious naturalisms and highlighting how each has contributed to this evolving worldview movement, theoretical space, whatever you want to call it. Religious naturalism is a lot. And so it continues to evolve. Yeah.
Right. And someone, Anne, is asking about the role for liturgy and ritual and so on. You know, at Yale Divinity School, we're now having more sermons on this topic of the environment and eco-morality and so on. And certainly ritual is moving forward in these directions, and music. There's a whole program coming up in February of music and song celebrating the earth. So I think when it gets into liturgy and music and the arts, people can feel it and sense it. So it's a wonderful question. Gosh, there's
a wonderful group called Atheopaganism, where they're taking the pagan rituals and leaving out some of the more woo aspects of it and just getting into the essential earth-centeredness of their rituals and their traditions and so on. And I love that. I mean, I think that religions have come up with all sorts of rituals, let alone the Native American traditions that speak to the earth. And we religious naturalists don't really have to invent something new. I remember Connie Barlow, one of the early people, she got us all out on the lawn on Star Island, and each of us was an element in the periodic table, and we were marching around pretending that we were calcium or something like that. And I thought it was lame. I want my rituals to be, poetic, and there are plenty of them out there. You just participate in them as a religious naturalist, as these rituals being part of the natural world. It works great. Yeah.
I noticed that Grove Harris is on this call, and I want to give a big shout out to her for her work with the temple and elsewhere. And I think it's a big question, so we can't quite get to it, but paganism has its own rituals that many people are following. And
both this and the fires and everything.
Yeah, exactly. And she's asking about overcoming patriarchy and dualism with religious naturalism, which is a huge, huge topic. But I want to conclude. So thank you, Grove, for your work. That's the basic thing here. And for many of you who I'm not able to get to all your questions, but since we're just about at the end, I want to give some time to Allison to close us out. Just any final comments from either of you about the role of religious naturalism, your passion for it, and how you see it growing going forward. There was a question about community, and you can look on Religious Naturalism's website for community and other activities. But any final thoughts from either of you on religious naturalism going forward?
Let's hear from Allison. I think we've said what we want. We're both
No.
evangelists.
Let's
Oh,
hear what Carol has to say, maybe. Just
all right.
I don't have anything to add. I would do invite people to visit our link and also go out and enjoy the natural world and help to take care of the natural world is what I would also say. Yeah.
great. Well,
Hug a tree.
well, I'm going to give a deep endorsement for this perspective. I've studied the world's religions. I have traveled extensively in Asia and around the world. And I think especially for Westerners who are looking for a way to be spiritual, to be embedded, embodied, transformative, and not fall into despair and disempowerment, that this is a regeneration of energies for an ecologically flourishing future, not just a sustainable future, a flourishing future because of its depth of science, thanks to Ursula and others, and its profound embrace of the arts and religious traditions. So thank you for this conjunction of science and religion, and thank you for the work that you've done to birth this in the world. Ongoing. All right, Allison, over to you.
Thank you, Mary Evelyn.
This has been an incredible, fascinating conversation, which I don't want to end, frankly. I'd like to just keep going. But I want to thank all of you, our speakers in particular, Mary Evelyn, for articulating something that is so powerful and so incredibly important. And it's making me think that maybe our annual forum will pick up on this topic and we will keep moving on it because it's just critical. I also want to thank all of those who have attended today, especially those who have donated to the Temple of Understanding to help us keep this series going. And I want to thank you, Mary Evelyn, for mentioning the biodiversity conference at the UN, because our next dialogue session will be about the outcome from participants who were at the COP15, and kind of what they bring back from that. So please keep an eye on our e-blast, and thank you all for coming, and thank you all for an amazing discussion.
Thank you.
Bless you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.